Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to session 4 of our Essential Christian Apologetics class. We're moving on through. Let's pray, and then we'll talk about where we're headed for tonight and then going forward. So, Father, we thank you once again for all you do in our lives, Lord God. We thank you for your creation. We thank you for your blessings and mercy and grace. We thank you for your salvation. We thank you for the opportunity, Lord God, to learn and explore truth, Lord. Help us to have minds that are able to fully perceive what you would reveal to us, Lord God. And help us, Lord, to just engage in this discussion with those who may struggle to understand the box top of life, as our authors like to use the term. So help us to have eyes to see, ears to hear, hearts to perceive, and lips and mouths to speak, Lord God, the truth of your word, the truth of your creation, wherever we go. And we just want to be prepared for it. That's why we're here. We ask, Lord, for you to equip us and guide us and lead us in all things, and we invite you here tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're in session 4, and the last couple of weeks have been fairly science-y. This will be our last foray into kind of science topics for the most part. We've been going through lines of evidence, if you will, and so as the authors tried to do in our primary book, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist book, is to start from a very, very beginning point. And just talk about, well, how can you ever know anything is real at all? How can you know what truth is? And we began to see that those claims that you can't know truth, end up falling apart on their own claims. They try to make claims like you can't know truth and all these things, and we start realizing, no, wait a minute, even making a claim like that is an appeal to truth, and therefore you do believe in some level of truth. So we believe in truth. And the next line of evidence is really looking at some of the best philosophical understandings or attempts to explain the universe or the world or whatever it is they would claim it to be that we live in, and do they actually hold any water? And the answer is typically no, they don't. There's not, in these philosophical systems, there's this discussion about, can you really know anything? And, again, using Immanuel Kant, is the tree outside the window really a tree, or you just imagine it in your own mind? How can you know? And we, hang on a second. Oh, all right. Sorry, I got to go back. I thought I moved that over. What the heck? That was really weird. Well, I don't know. Oh, I got to get the logo off. Oh my heavens. I hope if I knew that program better. All right, so now that's fixed. Sorry about that. All right, so we looked at the lines of evidence and philosophical claims. Can you know truth? And they don't seem to really explain existence all that well. We could look at Rene Descartes, going through his whole mental process, and I think, therefore I am. I must exist because non-things don't think. Right? That was his whole line of argument. We didn't see that in this book, but that's kind of that thought process is, hey, if I'm a thinking rational, I can decide this must be true, or I'm actually thinking about thinking, then I must exist. So that's kind of Rene Descartes. And then we've looked at these other lines of evidence to say, what does the evidence that we see around us, observable, even testable, and fitting within a logical framework, what does the evidence suggest to us about the universe we live in? And so we see the fact that the universe clearly, even by any kind of secular, atheistic, scientific claims, had a beginning. And so if a universe has a beginning, then something began it. And we haven't begun to truly answer the question of who or what that is. We just simply said a very valid line of evidence is the universe we live in has a beginning, and things don't pop into existence out of nothing. Certainly not something as complex and as well-designed and fine-tuned as we have. It certainly can't pop into existence out of nothing. We have no experience with that. So the most rational conclusion is something incredibly powerful and incredibly intelligent to create what we see has caused the existence that we live in. So we call that the cosmological argument. You can look up lots of information on the cosmological argument online or in various resources. I certainly encourage you for any of these lines of resources, answersingenesis.org or .com, I can't remember if it's both, and Institute for Creation Research. Having practically any question you've ever asked about how can I know this, or what's the scientific rationale on this particular point, they probably have dealt with it with their own in-house staff of PhD scientists and whatnot that they've looked at these things. So anyway, cosmological argument. And then we looked at the teleological argument, meaning looking at the end result of things. So the cosmological says, well, we see a beginning, and beginnings require something that began it, so that's one line of argument. The other one is when we look at the incredibly fine-tuned design of the universe and every aspect of it, it sure screams intentionality, it screams purpose, it screams a design that requires a designer, like a watch, Paley's watchmaker argument. A well-crafted watch requires a watchmaker. A well-crafted living organism requires a living organism creator, right, of some sort or another. And if any of you, I don't know if any of you watched the videos, I threw some up here on the screen before you got here. Can't really show them when we're doing live stream and things like that, just from copyright stuff and all that. But I gave you some links if you wanted to look at them. But what you see in the complexity of the DNA molecule and the construction, converting it from DNA to RNA so they can make a transcription of itself, and going through this incredibly fast process of copying more information than 1,000 encyclopedias in just a few seconds, basically, is incredibly fast and incredibly efficient and incredibly well designed. And that's just one small aspect of the cell. There's all kinds of other functions that happen within the cell, as we talked about before. There's there's like a post office, and there's a delivery system, and there's a waste management system, and there's energy management system, and there's obviously the self-replication of mitosis or meiosis within cells, and all these things that happen within cells. Incredibly complex. So we look at the end result of anything, and we see it doesn't look like an accident. Every accident I've ever seen causes destruction. Explosions rarely put together buildings, and tornadoes rarely put together airplanes, and accidentally dropping a box of Scrabble tiles on the floor rarely spells out a meaningful sentence, much less something so significant as to build a living system, right? But that's what we look at with the teleological argument. And then, so we've looked at these kind of components of things. We're going to look next week at the next phase of that, which is the moral argument, okay? And we've kind of alluded to that on a few occasions, that where does everybody get this sense of right and wrong from? And it always seems to be conforming to a unique and independent standard from people's opinions. People have different opinions about what the standards might look like, but they really don't differ very much on the fact that we have them and should obey them. We'll look at that next week. Today is just kind of a walk through the last part of the science and creation versus evolution type debates. This is just a very small thumbnail sketch of that. Again, there's a few weeks ago I had DVDs and videos and books and stuff up here. If you want to watch or read on that topic, there's just mountains and mountains of incredibly good information about that from a variety of resources. I can direct you in the right direction if you want more specifics on a specific topic or a general overview. So this one, the chapter 6 in our textbook, is called "From the Goo to You via the Zoo," right? And so, is that really the most descriptive box top of life? Is that how we actually got here? Did we start off in a non-living things, and then suddenly a single, very highly complex, single-celled organism popped into existence? And then did it have the capacity then to go into a multicellular organism, and then from multicellular organism into multifunctional systems with digestive systems and respiratory systems and circulatory systems and all of those other systems? Did it have the power to make that jump and that leap from a single cell floating around in a liquidy surface or a substance into, let's say, the pinnacle of things, mankind? Did it have the ability to get from A to Z to that point? We'll look at that kind of information tonight. So our question is, does the box top of life seem to indicate we came through the zoo. If you take a walk through the zoo and you look through at the orangutans and the gorillas and the lions and the reptiles and the fish, is that our pathway to our own existence? Or did we actually come about, as maybe Scripture has to say, we haven't gotten that far yet, that God formed us of the mankind, of the dust of the ground, and breathed the breath of life into our nostrils, and suddenly man became a living being. Which seems to be more descriptive or accurate against the facts and the evidence that we have. So, again, this is a little bit of covering ground we had last week, but let's continue through it. So, again, this is chapter 6 as your notes, and I put page references in there where it seemed appropriate to kind of direct you to these points. But repeated observations, the authors make a claim, tells us that the only intelligent beings create messages, right? And we looked at that a little bit last week in chapter 5, I think it was, where it says, take out the trash, Mom. And is that an accident? Should just ignore that. That has no meaningful purpose. It's just a scramble of letters that I could say tells me to do some chore that was on my list of chores to do. Or is it just accident? It just happened to fall into that circumstance. Well, we recognize that even the simplest of messages require an intelligent source for that information to have meaning and to have purpose, like we might see in a simple communication of a note from a mother to a son, and certainly in the level of complexity we see like in our DNA molecules that build our entire living systems. So even Carl Sagan, anybody not know Carl Sagan? The name, the Cosmos series that he started, certainly got me started on my road to atheism long ago. Watched the whole thing and just thought, well, sure, that makes lots of sense. Okay? Even Carl Sagan, very outward, forward, atheistic, materialistic human, realized that human brains, right, he would make the same claim, contain enough information, so our brains, average human brain, to fill 20 million books. So if intelligent beings cannot create anything close to the human brain, why should we expect non-intelligent natural forces and laws, or whatever these things are, accidents, to create the kind of information that's contained in the gray matter that happens in our brain? There's incredible amounts of intelligence in every human being. In fact, there's so much processing power going on in any given moment. Your brain, my brain, all of our brains are processing colors and motions and sounds, and our systems are breathing in, and we're blinking to make sure our eyes stay wet and moist, and all these things are happening. And our brains, the functions that aren't automatic, if you will, are happening. Our brains are calculating all these things. The calculations to walk a straight line for a bipedal type person is incredible. How much force to put forward, how much force to leave off, the stride, the balance, all of those things. Your ears are connected to your balance, and your eyes are connected to your balance. You may not know it if you haven't watched that video I told you, I think a couple of weeks ago, the seeing eye and the hearing ear, or the hearing ear and seeing eye, whichever one it was. He talks about that. Dr. Minton talks about that. Just walking down a line, your eyeballs do an ever so slight shift because you're off balance with every step. And so your eyeballs are shifting every single step, and you can't tell it. You're walking, you can't see that your one eye is dropping a little lower than the other to keep your sight level while you're going unlevel while you're walking across the room. Okay? All of those kind of calculations are happening within your eyeballs. So, and in your brain. So if our brains are that complicated, how, with 20 million books worth of information, where did that information come from? What is the most natural source we could appeal to in terms of why we have it? So we go all the way back and say, well, what about new life forms? So Darwinists, materialists, atheists, whatever nomenclature you want to put on that, still need to explain both the first cause of everything, like the Big Bang. That's the first cause of everything in our existence. And then they also have to explain the origin of the first life, biogenesis or abiogenesis, life from non-life, before they are able to take even the next step to advance the discussion to more newer and more complex life forms. They can't explain the Big Bang. They can't explain where nothing created something. And they can't explain, we've looked at, like with Sir Fred Hoyle and that whole 747 in a junkyard analogy and a 10 to 40,000th power worth of probabilities to get to the first components of life. And he said it's impossible. They can't get past that, but they still want to claim the next steps are that we really did, even though we don't have any explanation for how nothing created something, and something incredibly complex and incredibly fine-tuned, and we can't explain how chemicals and reactions and things like that went from non-life to suddenly life appeared. Can't explain that. Simply, we can't recreate it in a lab. We can't explain it on a whiteboard. We can't do any kind of explanations on those things. But then they want us to walk through the zoo and say, okay, ancestor, 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 ancestor. Oh, here I am, right? They want us to believe that. But we need to understand some major differences between two very different things that are usually conflated into one. Microevolution, you call that change within a species or a kind, a family matter, whatever it may be, and macroevolution, from species to species, or from family unit to family unit, or biblically from kind to kind. Is there any evidence that supports going from one kind to another? I'll use the term kind. It's most familiar to me because that's what God said in Genesis chapter 1. They will multiply according to their own kind. So, evolution by blind, non-intelligent forces, that's not a pejorative, that's what they claim, okay, that there's no intelligent forces behind evolution, it's just nature, is merely a hypothesis, okay? As such, blind forces don't make selections for anything. They have no preferences. So until it has function, the eye is one of the most common ones that we'll talk about, right? The eye, until it actually provides function, it provides no benefit to the organism. So if you're thinking about a fish, or you're thinking about a reptile, or a salamander or something, and you say, well, its survivability jumps from here to here when it has the ability to see to escape predators or to see to catch its own prey. Well, you have to have that functionality has to come into existence and be useful, because natural selection will not say, you know, that's a really good advancement. You can't see anything yet, but I see where you're going with that. Let's keep that thing around. Eventually it'll come to a benefit to you. No, it has to be fully functional, or it aids in no capacity, no form, the survival of that species. Okay? So it has to have, because natural selection needs to have a preference, but until the preference is actually a survival benefit, there is no preference selected. Okay? So survival of the fittest is what you hear a lot. You probably have ever been in biology class or any other kind of science class, or you look at this kind of information. They'll say the mechanism for life on the planet and all the variations and diversity that we see from the goo to us in the zoo, through the zoo, is survival of the fittest. Okay, they survive because there's this struggle and there's this battle, and the fittest survive. Well, we don't disagree with the fact that things that are stronger survive better than things that are weaker, right? A lion that is the king of its own jungle is far more able to survive if it kicks all of its competitors out, because it's the strongest lion around. And the younger ones, the weaker ones, can't compete against the strong lion. They can't find their own food source, and we can see they die off. No one disputes that animals that have a stronger survivable skill set don't survive longer. That's not the point. What we would refer to this in the logical scheme of things is called a tautology, okay? A circular argument that doesn't prove what it claims to prove, okay? So they want to claim that because the king of the jungle lion is better equipped to survive, somehow that means that that's how he got to become a lion, right? That he became a lion because of survival of the fittest. Well, a tautology is really saying the same thing twice without adding anything new to the meaning of something, right? So what they're doing is making a claim that survival of the fittest explains how our existence, or the arrival of the existence of life, but it's really just saying that things that are equipped to survive better than things that aren't equipped to survive. Okay? If you're not following this, let me try to help you with some more simplified examples. Okay? An evening sunset. Do you gain any new information by those two words? Does the sun ever set any time other than the evening? Right? So you're not getting any, you can talk about the sunset, but adding evening to it doesn't tell you anything you didn't already know. The sun was setting, it was evening. Okay? How about frozen ice? Okay? We want to be really, exaggerating. That ice was really frozen today. Well, is ice ever not frozen? I mean, water can exist in lots of forms, but if it's ice, it's frozen, right? You don't add any new information by saying, I want some frozen ice today. I heard it with my own ears, as opposed to hearing something from somebody else's ears. Right? These are tautologies. These are using the same word to make it sound like it's something meaningful is being said, when in the end you're all just saying the same thing. Okay? An over-exaggeration. Well, is there an exaggeration that isn't overstating something? Exaggeration is exaggeration. It's overstating something. So over-exaggeration is not very helpful in terms of language precision. How about close proximity? Can something be close without being in proximity? We use these terms all the time. I mean, most of these are not necessarily foreign to our ears, right? I'm going to be in close proximity to, the computer screen. Can you be in proximity to something without being close to it? Doesn't make any sense. The same thing, the same concept is true when you say survival of the fittest is the mechanism by which we brought about all the existence of species on the planet. No. We have species on the planet because they are able to survive in their environments. It doesn't say that that's how they became the species themselves. Okay? It's just it's a tautology, but it's also a diversion from the facts. The fact that there are no details that explain the arrival of a new species. So we need to kind of define evolution, and defining evolution is the single greatest point of confusion in the creation evolutionary controversy, right? So what do you mean by evolution? When I say evolution, does that mean or somebody says you don't believe in evolution, does that mean I don't believe in evolution? Really? That animals can't, in a sense, evolve? That's not what I'm saying. Or that's not what most creationists or biblical kind people would look at. They would say, no, I believe in evolution, but evolution has its limits, and its limits are defined by, in most cases, the digital code of the DNA. Okay? Evolution within a kind. We'll talk about some of that here in a moment. Like, in fact, this one is pretty well known. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria. You probably have heard somebody make some kind of claim about, well, antibiotic-resistant bacteria might prove evolution or has proven evolution. Okay? Let's talk about that for a moment. Okay? Surviving bacteria always remain bacteria. So what we find is we put antibiotics in something, and for a while it works, and the bacteria are killed off by the antibiotic. Then over time, and you probably all hear this, we can't give that antibiotic to you over long, because if we do, the bacteria could develop antibodies or a different mechanism to fight that off, and suddenly this drug, this antibody, won't fight against the bacteria. Okay, but what we find is in that even in those cases where there's been some changes, and we would call that change evolution, they're still bacteria. They haven't become a different species. In fact, they haven't added new information. What they've done, and scientists can easily confirm this, is they've stripped themselves down of unnecessary information in order to survive. So they've survived in species, but as a species, they are less equipped to fight off other issues down the road. Let me try to pull this in together. So it's like if you're on a ship, okay, and we can read this in like Acts chapter 28, isn't it, or 27, 28, whatever, where Paul and the sailors are in the ship, and they're realizing they're going to run aground, and they need to make way. And so in an emergency, what do? They start throwing off the cargo. There's this cargo ship, and we're running low. We need more mobility. We're overloaded, and they start throwing off stuff off the ship, okay, for the hope of surviving a shipwreck or avoiding a shipwreck. That's what bacteria are doing, is they're saying, this antibody is coming in and it's attacking this system within the wholeness of my bacteria, okay? And somehow it's been able to respond to its environment and say, well, if I throw that away, I can survive when that antibody comes back in and tries to kill me. Okay? But it never gets it again. And so it throws away some parts of its DNA, and then it becomes a less equipped bacteria, and it becomes less able to multiply and survive down the road. Okay? So it's not gaining this new ability. I'm so strong, I can fight off these antibodies. It's taking emergency action and saying, if I don't cast off the things that this antibody is trying to kill me with, I'll die. And somehow, some way, it's been programmed to cast those things off, but then it's 80% of what it used to be. It's 70% of what it used to be. And if it goes off and multiplies and divides, it will very easily die in a different environment where that antibiotic isn't even present. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I'm not. There's books and descriptions on how that could work, but it's that what we see is not a gain of new information. We see a loss, intentional loss of information for a short-term survival, not a long-term viability plan for the species itself. Yep. Right. Yeah, because I mean, you're dealing with. I mean, we're dealing with a fallen world, right? And so we have these things that are attacking our bodies, and we have medicine that's designed very specifically and very targeted to kill something that is causing us pain, causing us disease. And so it comes in and it does that. But, and I would make the appeal, the book hasn't gotten that far yet, but I would make the appeal that God put in every living thing a survival mechanism with which it can fend off attacks from outside, okay? And so it's fending off this attack that the medical professionals have injected or whatever into us, into you, and it's adapting to that, and over a period of time, it's adapted to the antibiotic, but adaptation means a loss of abilities, a loss of function, not a gain of into new superpower, okay? Like if you get in a car accident or you step on a landmine or whatever, or a hand grenade, and your leg is partially blown off, and they say the only way to survive the person is to cut off your leg, okay? We cut off the leg, and now I've survived that gangrene or whatever is trying to attack me, but no one would be claiming that me walking around with one leg versus two, I'm a better person for it, right? I've attacked what was attacking me, and I've cut something off, but I've gained no new functions. I've lost abilities, I've lost functions, but I have a short-term survival that I didn't have without that remedy. Did you have something, Kirk? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And we all knew it was coming, right? Right. But you see it coming. We've developed a vaccine for the COVID virus. I think we all knew that the virus would adapt and change, and suddenly the original vaccine wouldn't have the effect, even if it ever did, have the effect that it was supposed to have in terms of, we're going to eradicate this COVID thing. Well, no, it just keeps mutating. But in the mutations, you're not seeing a different virus. You're not seeing something new. You're seeing it finding ways in its survivability to cast off things that would destroy it so it can survive and keep going a little bit further. But it's not gaining new genetic information. Okay. Yeah, overall it's weakened, and so now it's like you said, it's like a bad cold. Okay. So natural selection has never been observed to create new types. We find no evidence in the fossil record. We certainly find no evidence in the zoo. We find no evidence anywhere at any time have we ever seen these supposed transitional forms or anything new that popped into existence. We just don't find it. We've been searching, or secular scientists and all that from even before Darwin have been searching and searching and searching, and in the lab trying to force new mechanisms, and they can only do limited amounts of manipulation. We're not ever seeing, there's been no observation of any new types. In fact, there's this meme out there floating around. I probably should have thrown it in here. Richard Dawkins, a well-known atheist and Christian or Bible hater, said, we know that Darwinian evolution has been, and natural selection or change over time has been observed. We just have never observed it ourselves. Like, wait a minute. You've never observed it, but it's been observed. It's happened. You know, it's like, we know it's, you know, and it's like, it's the most circular kind of statement or most self-defeating kind of statement you've ever seen. Like, it's happened, and we can prove it, but no one's ever seen it, so we can't prove it. We've never, ever seen, there's nothing in the marketplace where you can say natural selection has ever shown itself to create a new organism, a new type, a new function within an organism that wasn't already programmed in, that may have been dormant and then popped out, but not new functions that were never present in the first place. So the Darwinist claim, or the Darwinist claim, that small micro changes within a living organism can or should be extrapolated to prove that unobservable macroevolution, not micro, not changes within its own adaptability, but macroevolution, jumping out of a pond and onto the land, and jumping from cold-blooded to warm-blooded, or developing feet or getting rid of feet, and all of these kind of things. It's never been observed, okay? But they would like to convince the world that small micro changes prove that unobserved macroevolution must have occurred to create the vast numbers of all living systems in both plant and animal kingdoms. But this has no evidence to support it whatsoever. In fact, all the evidence we have actually supports the opposite view, that we have no new species, we have no mechanism by which to get from a amoeba to a fish to a salamander to a frog to a crocodile to a bird to a kangaroo. There's nothing that gets us there, right? We see no evidence of that. In fact, the opposite has always been true, that we see them. Well, let's walk through the logic here. So, by failing to admit, this comes from the book, failing to admit the critical distinction between microevolution, already present capabilities to change within a kind, and macroevolution, is used by Darwinists to dupe the general population into believing that these small, observable changes could be a viable mechanism to explain how all life originated from a single first cell. Now, if you're like me and you watch various things that tried to explain this, you know, you've probably heard of Darwin's finches from the Galapagos Island, and you've probably heard of like the peppered moths, okay? None of these have proved anything that they claim to prove, okay? In fact, the peppered moth thing was really a fraud, by the way. But when we look at dogs, or we look at birds, or we look at any of these species, we say that they clearly have within their DNA the ability, let's say with a finch in beak sizes or beak shape, they have the ability, if food requires a longer, thinner beak, that if that's where the food sources are, those with a fat beak and a short beak will probably die off. And when they die off, they won't reproduce, because that's not what the food source is available for on the island. And so the long beaks survive. And we see, but if the food source changes, and suddenly a short beak is beneficial and a long beak is detrimental to the species, those same exact finches will start to, within their own variability, they will start to see the beak size shrink not because a different bird landed on a plant, or not because this bird populated something that's not a finch anymore. It's because the preferential of the environment allowed for preferential beak sizes to change over time. And we've seen that happen not over thousands of years or millions of years. We see it happen within 1 or 2 generations. Suddenly, the fact that all beak sizes, short and long, fat, wide, whatever they are all inherent in the DNA of every finch. And the environment dictates which one seems to survive in some particular season of time. Okay? And so, we see that variability built into the species, and it's constant there. You can also see it, let's say, with dogs, okay? And let's go with the hypothesis that all dogs started from 2 kinds aboard Noah's Ark, okay? And they had all of the characteristics necessary for the dog kind, which includes wolves and dingoes and actual domestic dogs and various other kinds of animals. I think there's probably 20 of them or something. All of that was built in. But let's just take dogs, okay? And let's say... You said 2 kinds. I think you meant 2 dogs. Well, yeah, 2 dogs. Yeah, 1 kind, male, 2 dogs. Yeah, male and his female. Right. Thank you, Les. Yeah. And so from that, we could see easily that if it suddenly starts to get cold, dogs that have a gene for longer hair will end up surviving in colder climates. And if they wore into tropical climates, long-haired dogs would die off, but short-haired dogs would survive, right? And you see that, but you can get from 1 kind, 1 mate, 1 pair of mates, you can see that the variability easily goes out. What you don't have is, as you go off to these all the kinds, and we use this with selective breeding, right? We recognize, okay, all dogs really go back to a common ancestor, but I want a dog with a short nose. Well, I want a dog with a long nose. And so with human intelligence, we preferentially breed long hair, short hair, long nose, short nose, whatever all the different features are, big dog, small dog, whatever it is, we preferentially breed for that. And as we do that, we start to push out to the extremes. But when you push out to the extremes, and those dogs have lost the DNA. Let's say you've got short-haired dogs, and they've got DNA that can only now produce, because you've selectively treated only short-haired dogs. You move them to a cold climate, they no longer have the DNA to get back to long hair, okay? Because we breeded that out of that particular species. So they're going to die, and they're never going to go back to long hair. But if you start with the original pair, they can go in every direction, and they can have all the traits. And this is the same thing with skin tones in humans and all the other stuff. This is all just basic genetics, just like with eye color. Let's use eye color as another one, right? If parents are intentionally going, I want to be like the Aryan race of Hitler, and I want to make sure everybody's blonde hair, blue-eyed. And you start going, okay, I'm only going to marry blonde hair, blue-eyed, and we're going to make sure we have blonde hair, blue-eyed. This was what Hitler was trying to do, right? Is get everybody down to that blonde hair, blue-eyed makeup, and he wanted to purge the population of everything else. If he had succeeded, you would never, ever, ever get back to dark hair, dark eyes of some other variety, because he breeded it out, and there's no longer a dark eye, dark hair genetic makeup in these Aryan races that they came up with. But you can only get down to that by selectively breeding it out. Okay? But obviously, all human beings started with that same adaptability, variability within the genetic code. So when we look at amoebas, we look at dogs, we look at humans, we look at finches. I mentioned the peppered moths. Sorry. The peppered moths, they actually were just pinning them to the trees. They were taking black moths and pinning them to black trees, and white moths and pinning them to white trees. This was always just a fraudulent activity that was trying to prove evolution at the high scale when it didn't prove anything. It just proved that there's variabilities within moths. That particular moth could go dark or light, and they were then just pinning them to the trees. So it doesn't matter. You have variability within the species. In order for that variability to occur, it has to already be present in the DNA. If you strip it out, you can definitely make distinctions and differences in microevolutionary changes. but you can't make macroevolutionary changes because you don't have information in the DNA. And the more you select out, the less capable those species are of surviving if the environment around them changes. Okay, long hair, short hair, white moths, dark moths, doesn't matter. If you breed it out, then they're not going to be able to survive if the environment changes. What we see is that the designer of all things built in original form incredible survivability, incredible variability into the original kinds from plants and animals and people right from the very beginning. So Jonathan Wells is a Christian, was I think maybe at this point, scientist, and he says biochemical mutations cannot explain large-scale changes in the organisms that we see in the history of life, which is, again, what we see. The observable evidence tells us we don't see large-scale changes. We only see micro-changes, and those micro-changes are easily explainable by the fact that the information to adapt that change is already present in the original life form. So the book talks about 5 reasons natural selection and genetic mutations fail as an explanation for what we see in the world today. Okay. Genetic limits, okay, according to their kind. Intelligent, again, covering what we just talked about really, but intelligent dog breeding always produces dogs. It never produces cats. It never produces horses. Never produces fleas. Okay. It only produces dogs. Okay. And that's what we see. That's the limit. That's the boundary with which you can use genetic manipulation of any kind. Now, okay, yeah, we can take a plum and a pear and genetically mix them and get some combination between the two, but we can't take a pear and a dog and get some kind of combination between those two things, right? They're too far apart genetically, and so we don't see that kind. We can't take a dog and a cat and put them together and get something else. They're two different kinds. Now, we can take a donkey and a horse and get a mule, but they're of the same basic kind. Okay. Laboratory experiments with fruit flies, guess what? Always produce more fruit flies. They've never produced any new species. Why do they use fruit flies? Because their life cycle is like days, right? 3 or 4 days at most, I think is probably what it is. So they can go through what they might consider to be millions of years of evolutionary forces in a laboratory over the course of, let's say, 5 or 10 years. Because they just keep producing new and new and new and new generations of fruit flies over and over and over and over again. And what do they keep getting every single time? Fruit flies. What they would consider to be like the equivalent in a laboratory environment of millions of years worth of genetic material opportunities for change, and they only get fruit flies. And believe me, they've been trying to get something else, but they only get fruit flies. Mules, as I said, very close cousin, are sterile, and and this is often the case when we take 2 different, all part of the same kind, but we would call them different species. A lot of times they're sterile. You can produce them in a generation, but they themselves can't recreate according to their own species because they're sterile when they come to that point. That's not always true, but it oftentimes is true. So they have this table there in chapter 6. They talk about the differences between what you might say artificial selection, like intentional breeding, and natural selection, meaning unintentional, no guidance whatsoever in the process. So this seems helpful. Like if you want to breed a short hair dog, or you want to breed let's do something really weird, a hairless cat. Okay, yeah, you want to breed a hairless cat. Okay. You're going to selectively breed until you get to the point where the cat you're looking for is hairless. Okay? You have a purpose. You have an aim. You're saying, I will always keep breeding until I get to a hairless cat. Okay? Were the original cats hairless? No. But you can selectively breed to that point. You can get a hairless dog or a hairless cat. That's your goal. Natural selection has no purpose, no aim, no guidance toward getting us to a hairless cat or a hairless dog. Right? It's never going to do that, and it probably has no survivable, benefit to the organism to be hairless. more than likely it's either going to sunburn to death or it's going to freeze to death or whatever. It's probably not a benefit to the organism. But if people want it, with human intelligence, we can artificially select for that trait. So there's a process. Well, we use intelligence to get there. There's no intelligence in natural selection. Choices. You have a preference. You have an aim. You have a goal. You have some kind of, you can see what you're looking for and select for it. There's no preference again, and no choices being made by preference. Protection. You can protect. You can say, this cat is 30% shorter or less hair than this cat. I see that. I'm going to protect it because I want to keep advancing that particular trait. Again, no protection. Freaks. Well, you're preserving the freaks, hairless cats, right? In this case, you're saying, I'm looking for the freak. I want something new and novel to come out of this. But in natural selection, it's always going to be eliminated because it gains no benefit to the species. In interruptions, or interpretations, as many as needed, right? You can just keep going and going and going and going. You say, I'm going to keep going. But with natural selection, it's unguided, so it never knows when it found something beneficial, and so it just loses it even if something were to occur. And then survivability of a species. Preferential, yes, because you want it to survive, so you keep it and guard it and protect it. And again, natural selection offers none of these things, and so it offers no benefit that we can see, and certainly there's no observable evidence that these kind of changes have happened. So, you kind of jump to a conclusion here. If intelligent scientists cannot break genetic barriers, why would we expect unguided and purposeless natural selection to have superior capabilities? If we can't get a salamander to turn into a snake, with all of our technology and all of our information and knowledge on DNA, why would we expect that natural unguided selection would be able to make that jump on accident, with purposeless? And this doesn't even count all of the weaknesses that would go between. A lot of times we talk about like a snake to a bird, a reptile to a bird, right? Well, it's got to go through a whole bunch of changes. And most of those changes would not just not benefit the survivability of the species, it would be very detrimental. Can you imagine a snake crawling around with a bunch of extra feathers on it, but the feathers won't let it fly and escape away predators or fly to catch prey? It's just dragging around a bunch of feathers with it, going, I can't wait till I get to be a bird someday, right? It's got no additional survivability to it. And the hollow bones that birds have that snakes don't have. What good are hollow bones to an animal that needs to survive on the ground? None, right? Why would we expect these? And of course, Darwin, in his Origin of Species book, he talks about that. He says, if my theory were true, the fossil record ought to be filled with transitional forms. We ought to find way more fossil forms in transition than we find in actual completed forms. Because to get from a snake to a bird, there ought to be like 40 million different attempts that you can see the sort of changes happening, and then you get from a snake to a bird. So there ought to be just filled with it. And he then looks at it and says, but even back 150 years ago, or whenever our Darwin wrote, he said, but the lack of evidence is perhaps the most damaging fact against my own theory, right? There's no transitional forms. Well, in 150 years since Darwin, and we've got the world on fire looking for transitional forms, we still have zero to account for. Every single claim that they've had as a transitional form has later been proven, if not immediately proven, to just simply be a different animal we never knew about before. Fully complete, no transition one kind to another. Its own genetic structure. Okay. So, then they talk about cyclical change. Changes within a species, shifting as we talked about with finches or moths or whatever, shift back and forth within a very limited range. And it's always done to meet their environmental changes that aid their survival. So do we believe in the survival of the species? Yes. Or that the fittest survive and all of those kind of claims. Yeah, we believe in that. And as it gets warmer, it changes and certain traits will be preferential. It gets colder, certain things will change and certain traits will be more preferential. but they never shift, make these big jumps from kind to kind. We do not see that. You would find, you go to all natural history museums in the world, you won't find a transitional form. You might find claims on a placard somewhere that says it's a transitional form, but it's not actually a transitional form. It has no, you can't see the partial snake and the partial bird, the partial fish and the partial gecko, whatever it is. So we see again, changes never result in new forms or even permanent changes. The only time it's ever permanent is if it's lost so much of its genetic information, it can't go backwards anymore. Okay, that's the only time we see it, the permanency of the changes. But within a species or a kind, we see continued survivability built within the variability of the genetic code in the animal itself. Natural selection may aid in explaining the survival of the species, but genuinely it offers no evidence for the arrival of a species. These are really just plain facts. It should not be disputed, even though the Darwinists and the evolutionists and all of that hold on to this thought process with incredible vigor and tenacity, but there's really they can't explain the arrival of the species because, again, it's a digital code within the DNA, and it offers no insights on how you can change a digital code to jump from one species kind to another. Then we get to irreducible complexity. This term's been around now for probably 25 years or so. I think it was genuinely or originally coined by Michael Behe. There's a few quotes from him in here. Irreducible complexity, we'll walk through this and talk about a couple things. Okay. So in order for a genetic mutation using natural selection to be beneficial for the survival or the adaptability of a species, it must prove to be beneficial within a single generation. Okay, this is what I'm talking about with a snake with feathers and hollow bones and whatever else it's got going on. It has to aid survivability, or it will not, by the laws of natural selection, be preserved. And if it's not preserved, there's no way it's going to be passed on to successive generations. So because macroevolution, the big changes, hypothesizes that successive multi-part mutations have come together as a beneficial change, then all the mutations must happen simultaneously and within a single generation for a selection to occur that gives survival preference to a new species. Okay, so we can take the eyeball for a moment of anything. The very first sight, right? So an amoeba didn't have sight, and then suddenly a trilobite or something had eyes, and you say, okay, well that certainly would have aided the survivability of species. Okay, let's just take our eye for example. Okay, when it's incredibly complex, but you suddenly have a lens, and you have an iris, and you have receptor cones, and you have all the millions or so of these optic nerves that go from the brain to the eyeball and all of that. I give you any of those, it won't aid the survivability of species until it's all hooked up and working and functioning properly. Beyond that, all you do is you got a mess. You got a little soft part and that leads right to the brain, and any prey can come in and you can't see it, but it's going to kill you because it's got easy access to your brain. All of those parts have to function at the same time. So in Darwin, he even talked about the eye, the complexity of the eye, and thought, boy, that's a really hard one to resolve by my theory, because it's got so many parts to it. It's got so many different pieces, parts and pieces of it, and it's just connected, and it works, and how does it all happen? Darwin couldn't figure it out. There's been lots of, you can find all kinds of, atheistic, Darwinistic kind of thinking out there. We'll try to somehow explain the eye. They'll also try to explain, well, the eye really isn't the ideal design. If I were designing the eye, it would be so much better if I would have done it rather than, natural selection or God or whatever. But they actually showing a whole lot of ignorance, because the eye is incredibly, incredibly precise and complex. The fact that you can see clearly is a miracle all by itself. You got to have a liquid film right over the top of the eye. It's got to be right at the right viscosity. It's got to be right at the right level of clarity. And I mean, anything else, every person on the planet would just have blur vision. Really fine-tuned, the eye. And then it has to communicate to the brain to tell it something. So it's really in this area. So your irreducible complexity. irreducibly complex system is comprised of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively stop functioning. So it talks about like single cells are irreducibly complex. If you look at that, like I've talked about several times now, cell, way more complex than anything that human beings have ever built in their entire existence. Okay, way more complex. Not even close. The DNA is the most complex and most dense information storage and retrieval system on the planet. Way more storage capabilities in our DNA than any computer that's ever been built, and it can copy and replicate itself way faster than any computer could possibly generate that much of information. And that's just the DNA in the cell. All the other functions, all the other parts of the cell are also incredibly complex. Okay? And we also have that chicken and the egg thing that we talked about, where DNA makes protein, and DNA is made up of protein, so how do you get one without the other? Right. There's a Michael Behe's book talks about the flagellum motor in a cell, in a bacteria, and I included that link, or a link to some of that, in last week's notes. It looks like, really, they talk about it looks just like an outboard motor for a boat. Okay, it's got a motor and a rotor and a stator, and it's got a drive shaft, and it's got a propeller, and it's got all this kind of stuff. It's got like hundreds of different parts that would not move that amoeba through the water, like a microscopic level, unless it all functioned and all worked at the same time. It has to be built and functional, and not only that, it has to be built in a specific order. Like it needs a blueprint of how to build it. You have to build the shaft, you have to build this, you have to build that, and then it all comes together. Like I said, there's a video in last week's notes if you actually get that typed in, or just type it, go to Google and type in flagellar motor, or flagellar motor, and it will bring up probably 50 or 60 different videos on it. Any one of them will show you whether it's from a Christian and a creationist, or a scientist that has no religious viewpoint other than their own religion of atheism. It will still show you that this flagellar motor is incredibly complex. Could not possibly work or function, and successive changes over time. So visual systems are talked about, and then talk about cars and mousetraps. Like a car, just think about I'll talk about a mousetrap in a second, but think about a car. How good is a car if it has no wheels? Right? It can't go anywhere. It's got everything else. It's got lots of, $1 million car or $100,000 car with no wheels doesn't get you very far. Just like a $100,000, Corvette or Mercedes-Benz or whatever won't get you anywhere if you don't have any gas, right? Or maybe we should say a $150,000 Tesla won't get you anywhere if you can't charge the thing, right? You can't, if it's not fully functional, it offers no benefit. Right? What are you going to do with a Tesla that you can't drive down the road? Sit in it and wish you could drive down the road? How does that aid the survivability of the species? So the simple one that what Michael Behe originally talks about is the mousetrap. It's one of the most simple contraptions you can find. And so we just walk through this for a second. So you got the base plate, you got a food catch, you've got a hammer that when the little critter tries to get the food, the hammer comes down and breaks its neck. And then you got the catch that comes over the top of the hammer to keep it from tripping until the actual mechanism is tripped, right? So you got 4 or 5 basic parts to this thing. And the question is, if you take one of those parts away, how many mice can you catch? That's called irreducible complexity. You can't catch any mice with with fewer moving parts than you got here. And you take the hammer away, well, it all works, but you don't kill the mice. You take the bait trap away, well, it doesn't catch the mice. It all has to work. You have to have it all functioning. It's super simple. I don't know how much they are these days. So you probably buy 50 of them for $10 or something, right? They're super cheap, and there's nothing complex about it. But it simply catches no mice if it doesn't have all its functional parts. And you equate that to let's say an amoeba trying to become a trilobite. It's got to get all of those functions up and operational and helping its survivability, or it's not going to be preserved through the natural selection process. it's just a bunch of garbage and weight it doesn't need, it will not survive. And any more than a mousetrap with 3 parts will catch, one third less mice. No, it catches 0 mice, even if it has 1/3 less parts. All right, with that, that's the kind of the Michael Behe and irreducible complexity mind exercise we have for there. We'll take a break and come back and talk about the rest. Sorry, Rick, we're back on now. And so incredibly complex flight dynamics that happen within all of this stuff. And then when you also think about it, when you think about it from the moment of, hey, evolution didn't just have to develop flight once with birds. We have flying reptiles, we have birds, we have flying insects, right? We have flying mammals. It had to develop flight multiple times by chance and accident, even though it's incredibly complex. Doesn't seem to match. Molecular isolation. So commonalities within DNA in living systems cannot and does not prove macroevolution. So if our, and also function this, okay? So if our protein structures, we talked about like the chimpanzee and human DNA and things like that last week a little bit. If our protein structures among living systems were not compatible, the entire food chain of all living systems would be impossible, okay? We need the cow to eat the grass and get its nutrition from the grass, or we can't eat the cow. And if we eat the cow, and if we don't have compatible protein structures, it can't feed our protein, and so all we're doing is eating nothing, and it's passing right through us, and it's gaining no energy, and we would die, right? So if we can't eat, and we're omnivores, right? If we can't eat plants, or we can't eat animals because we have compatible DNA, nothing would survive. We have to have compatible protein systems so that I can eat these things, okay? And we all can survive, and that's going through the entire, what we call circle of life, okay? Everything relies on something else for its survival, okay? Trees and plants and all that, you know what? They depend on our production of carbon dioxide in order for us to breathe, for them to get what they need, and we need their oxygen and every other aspect of it, no matter if it's a herbivore or an omnivore or a carnivore. We need something to eat, and something needs us, and it all just keeps going back and forth. It's all part of a massive and incredibly complex circle of life system in the biosphere that we live in. So, we talked about this again last week again, but similarity of design is not proof of common ancestry, okay? Just like I can go into the parking lot here, and I can take two different cars that look really fairly similar. Does it mean they came from the same factory? No. Does it mean they came from the same manufacturer? No. Does it mean it came the same engineering blueprint who designed both cars on the drawing board? No. It just means they're similar, right? They may have had, one person may have stolen the idea from somebody else, but it does not prove that they had an ancestral relationship. Two Ford F-150 pickup trucks. One may have been made in Detroit and one may have been made in Mexico. You can't tell by looking at the truck without other kind of information. You can't say, well, this 1972 Ford somehow is clearly, was in the genetic lineage of a 1995 Ford pickup, right? There's just nothing. You can't tell because of common design doesn't prove common ancestry in non-living things and or in living systems. And at the molecular level, there is no trace of evolutionary transitions as proposed by the Darwinian theories. Okay? There are no transitions in the molecular record, only gaps between all species. That's all we see. And the fossil record is a complete embarrassment to all Darwinianists. It should be, if they're willing to accept what they see as fact. Okay? It confirms nothing according to the theory. It doesn't reveal anywhere any kind of gradualism and a development of this Darwinian tree of life. Okay? We don't see a tree of life. What we see is a orchard. Okay? We see the dog kind and the canid, or the cat kind, and we see the equine kind, and we see the fruit tree kind, and we see all kinds of kinds, and we can trace them all the way back down to their original source, but we don't see any jumping from this tree to that tree. We don't see one tree. We see a forest of trees according to created kinds. And most species exhibit no directional changes at all. They are today as they've always been in the observable record. And we'll see a little bit more of that in a moment. All life forms have a sudden appearance, fully developed into their final forms. We don't see partial anything. We see fully developed. We may have extinction of certain species, but even at the levels of extinction, we see fully formed, fully functional animals or other living things, not a transition of any kind. So without a favorable fossil record, meaning no transitional forms as proposed, okay, Darwinianists have proposed punctuated equilibrium, which has been coined as a term for a hopeful monster. Okay? A hopeful monster meaning a snake laid an egg, and that egg popped out a bird. Okay? That's a hopeful monster. It wasn't a snake that had some bird parts to it. Because we find no transitional forms, they have advanced the idea of punctuated equilibrium that says in one generation, in one lifetime, a snake popped out a bird. Well, actually, it must have popped out two birds, because I need a male and a female in order for them to reproduce and carry on according to their kind. So any time this happened, I need two hopeful monsters, a male and a female with fully functioning reproductive capabilities that are fully compatible one with another in one generation, or the whole system falls apart. But that doesn't stop people from advancing punctuated equilibrium as a viable theory, which it's not. There are no such things as a missing link, because the whole evolutionary chain is missing. You can't find it. The tree of life is a myth. It's not fact. There is no evidence of a transitional form. Okay? What we observe are forests, according to the biblical kinds, not a single tree where everything started and advanced into everything else from there. The Cambrian explosion, or the Cambrian record, maybe it's a term you've heard of before or read about or know a lot about, but that's often referred to, for those who haven't seen this before, is the biology's Big Bang. Okay? Cambrian explosion, Cambrian, whichever pronunciation you prefer, evidences all of what we see. So they dig down, Cambrian level, is this really low and considered ancient, although in my view it's only 6,000 years old or less, 4,500 years more likely. But they see below the Cambrian level, they see virtually no living systems. Okay? And then they get to the Cambrian level, and they see in this explosion of life, some of which are no longer with us, and many of which look just like they look today. Okay? Supposedly, or whatever, 65 million years or 250 million years, I don't remember the age of the Cambrian layers as they hypothesize it to be. But whatever it is, these forms and these creatures they find in there look exactly like they do today. So let's just say 500 million years. I don't know what the age is. Let's say 500 million years. It looks no different, no changes in 500 million years, or 100 million years, or 65 million years. Okay? And what they find there is not a whole bunch of almost wannabe snakes and birds and fish and reptiles and anything else. They just find actual living body plans, or body plans that were alive. And then so that leads to speculation. Well, maybe all those transitional forms lived and then they got washed away, but there was no fossil record for them. Well, that's a lot of speculation, but the evidence that you look at is what? No transitional forms. Everything in its final, fully complete state at the earliest level of finding existence of life in the fossil record. Years ago, since soft tissue would not remain viable for even 1 million years by virtually any scientific estimation, much less 65 million years. But like if you ask Mary Schweitzer, the first archaeologist or whatever who found this stuff, paleontologist who found this, and her lab assistants were saying, hey, it looks like we got soft tissue here. She kind of went through the whole thing, and she finally just said, well, I guess soft tissue does last for 65 million years. Okay, no, every other evidence says it's impossible, but you're going to say, well, okay, maybe it can last for 65 million years. Why? Because I have a fully pre-committed notion that dinosaurs are 65 million years old. They couldn't possibly be 4,500 years old. because that's about the time frame you expect soft tissue to remain. And there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of new finds of dinosaur soft tissue in the last 25 years. It just exploded. And yet the persistence of it must last that long just seems to be around. So anatomical similarities are irrelevant, right? Just because a lot of creatures have 2 eyes and hair and digestive systems, and some of them even have somewhat opposable digits on their hands and can grasp trees and that kind of stuff. It doesn't prove anything in terms of an ancestral relationship, okay? And it certainly doesn't confirm the theory. All it does is say, my speculation is that humans are related to chimpanzees, or humans are related to orangutans, or whatever the claim that they want to make is. It's not evidence, it's not fact, it's wishful thinking that says, this is the best explanation that supports my theory. It's not based on evidence, okay? Because there are no transitional forms, and common traits do not support it doesn't support the claims. We would make the claim, or those who believe in a creation that brought us into existence would say, a common designer has used common or similar structures within a multitude of living systems. Shouldn't surprise us. Intelligent design alternative. And so the book here talks about intelligent design as an alternative to Darwinian evolution. I put in my own quotes here, approach this subject with caution, okay? If you're a Christian, if you're committed to the authority of Scripture, I will tell you that virtually all intelligent design proponents remain relatively silent on Scripture and on the existence of God, okay? They're just saying, we believe in intelligent design, but the religious implications of that are up to you to decide, not us. So they're scientists, and a lot of them create really good books and materials. There's a lot of like YouTube videos and certainly other DVD sources out there, really good at explaining that intelligent design, meaning there's an intelligence that designed everything in our universe, is they have really good information. But don't follow them down the trail of getting close to God but not actually accepting God. Okay? That's what a lot of them seem to have done. Some of them may be Christians, but if they're Christians, they want to keep that information very suppressed and hidden. They don't want anybody to know it in their scientific world and community. With that absolute certainty, yeah. Unless they're working for a creation ministry of some sort or another, they're probably going to be ostracized. They're going to lose their funding. They're going to lose their job. They're going to no longer have a career because that's the pressure of the world. And this is no different than it was in Galileo's day, or any other scientist's day, or Capernaum, or whatever, who makes these claims, and then they get killed, or at least threatened, and lose everything they have because they made a claim that doesn't match with the scientific thinking or dogma of the day. And 100 years later, after they're dead, people go, oh yeah, the Earth really does revolve around the sun. I guess we shouldn't have killed him, or tried to, or whatever. So. But yeah, you're certainly right, Bill, that they maintain that level of non-religious moniker so as to keep funding for their position. But I would just say that I would be very concerned if I led hundreds and hundreds of people, or thousands and thousands of people, to reject Darwinianism but never got them to believe in a savior. Right? That should be the next alternative, but didn't get them there. So back to, anyway, there is some good information that we can gain from intelligent design discussions. So intelligent design is the alternative, if you will, to Darwinian evolution, and it keeps the word God, and it keeps the word creation, and it keeps the word accountability to a savior all out of the conversation. But let's see what they have to say. So with natural selection and Darwin's tree of life debunked, I think we can clearly make that claim. There's simply no evidence for it. People can still believe it, they can champion it, they can build their careers on it, but there's no evidence for it, right? There's nothing in the fossil record, there's nothing within the genetic code that allows for that kind of variability and adaptability to be present within a different species. So it's debunked, okay? So if we debunk the Darwinian proposal for how we've got to life, and how we got to human life on this planet, the only other option is intelligent design. There's no third option between blind natural forces that can't create what we need them to create and intelligence as the only alternative cause. Okay? So science, we see, is now confirming intelligence as the most plausible reason for all cosmological and all biological systems that exist today. Science is now ready to make some of those assertions. Doesn't mean they're Christian, doesn't mean they're Bible believing. It means they're believing in some higher power, intelligent force capable of creating everything. Aliens, yeah, that can certainly fall into that category. Intelligence provides the best explanation for what we observe. That really is a fact. Okay? Appealing to intelligent design is not a God of the gaps cop-out like many would charge those who hold this view as. It's not used to mask ignorance. It's actually the best, most rational explanation that matches the evidence that we have. You look at the complexity, you look at a cell division, and you look at the copying process of DNA, you look at how all of this survivability is built into the DNA of a system, and you say it had to have been by a result of purposeful, intelligent design, not random, accidental, without purpose guidance that brought them to this. Okay? So it's not a God of the gaps. It's saying God did it, or saying intelligent must be responsible for the result. Intelligent design remains open. Here, and this is really, make sure you catch this. Okay, this one's kind of important. Intelligent design proponents remain open to both intelligence and natural forces as explanations in their search for the truth. They're not closing down any line of evidence. They're saying, what I see could be explained by intelligent creation. Or maybe it came about by natural processes. Whichever one the evidence shows me is where I'll make my conclusion on. Whichever one. Darwinists are not open to intelligence as a cause. This rejection of intelligence is based on their own preconceived biases, not the facts that we see in the world that we observe. So, I think that's an important distinction, that those who are advancing this intelligent design theory are saying, we're open to both. We're open to all explanations. Aliens. We're open to natural processes. We're open to God. We're open to something. We're not closing down any line of evidence because we don't like the implications of it. Darwinianist has always been about rejecting God and replacing God with some non-accountable force that brings about life. Intelligent design is also open to being proven false. If evidence could ever be discovered that would disprove it. They're saying, look, as a movement, they're saying, you can disprove, scientifically, we should always be open to being falsified, right? Because we don't want to hold on to a lie. We don't want to hold on to a falsehood. We don't want to advance and teach and proclaim something that's not true. So please continue to test, continue to show evidence, continue to research. If something we've said is falsifiable, it should naturally and automatically be cast aside as not true. Darwinian theory and its proponents are not open to competing theories that would prove Darwinianism false. They're committed only to that solution. So they're committed to that, and they do not accept any charges that would falsify their claims. So these are two fairly philosophically important distinctions between the two movements. Darwinists willfully ignore the positive, empirically detectable evidence for intelligent design, and an intelligent being who is the one who created these designs. They are letting their religion, Darwinianism, overrule objective scientific observation. So no worldview is completely free of bias. Can we all agree? No one's perfect. No one is completely free of bias. So no worldview, not a science, there's no objective scientist, there's no objective Christian, there's no objective intelligent design proponent, there's no objective agnostic who says, I can never know and you can never know and all that. No worldview is completely free of bias. So the claim that intelligent design is motivated by religious beliefs is not actually a valid objection to their hypothesis or the claims that they're making. having personal beliefs for or against a position doesn't change observable facts. Okay? So this intelligent design movement is shielded or guarded in their approach to trying to advance a different alternative to Darwinian evolution. They're saying, look, the fact that we don't subscribe to this over here, let's say Orthodox Christianity, and we don't ascribe to Darwinian evolution, is simply saying, look, of course we have biases, but we are open to any type of, fact checking. And if what we're proposing is not true, it should, of course, be cast out. But we believe that what we're proposing is supported by the observable facts. Again, they're not a single claim I've ever seen in intelligent design is saying the God of the Bible doesn't exist. They just don't go there. And they're just not saying, therefore, if God or if intelligent design is the only explanation for the existence of the universe, the existence of life, the existence of mankind, the existence of the anthropic principle that says all these things are perfectly aligned and fine-tuned for life, that's fine, but they're in most cases, like we said, for protection of financial and career interest or whatever, they won't say, well, then you should believe in Jesus. They're just simply saying, we hold this position, we want to be as neutral and not religious as we can be. Again, I think it would be just a shame for someone who, like I used to be, a hardcore Darwinian believer in all of that, to get into the intelligent design camp, but end up not having a relationship with God in the end, because I only went as far as they went. But the conclusion here of intelligent design, or the conclusion they come to, flows naturally from the data, not from sacred books, right? They're not coming to this and saying, well, Genesis 1:1 teaches that God created in 6 days, therefore we have to find a solution that matches with that account. They're saying, whatever the evidence is, we'll support it, and they're saying the evidence is intelligence, is the responsible force behind all creation. Okay. But I wouldn't follow them down the religious path. Darwinism must be rejected as a philosophical view and a scientific claim because it does not fit the scientific data, and it never has. Never once has it ever fit the data. It's always fit the most hopeful expectations, never the evidence. Intelligent design as a theory does fit the observable data, and it should be accepted in terms of its implications without having to be required to the Bible. And that's where we've been coming to, right? So in this whole book, in the whole study through this book to this point, there's been a few references to the Bible, a few references to God, but really they're not saying to say, look, we've proven God exists. At this stage in our philosophical treatise, all we've said is we can believe that reality is existent, and we should be able to understand reality with our own senses and our own intelligence. And we see that these philosophical claims have fallen flat. We see that the universe had a beginning. We see the universe has design. We see that all the evidence supports an intelligent source that brought everything into existence. That's where intelligent design stops. Our text, our study through this course will then delve into, well, is there a religious text that gets us to an answer about the reality that we live in? So we'll get there. They haven't made that claim yet. Again, I'm just cautioning. You can find all kinds with Michael Behe and others out there, all kinds of intelligent design websites and information. You will almost certainly not see the name Jesus. You probably won't see a reference to God. You will always just see an ID, intelligent design, as if that somehow represents the force. Hang on. Mm-hmm. They do draw a big target on their career, right? And so they can still be employed at secular universities and get published in peer-reviewed journals and all of that, because they are not trying to impose a religious view on the scientific community. And so at that they're playing that part safe. as I said, but now, of course, you do have plenty of, with Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, the Biblical Science Institute, and some others, they are full-fledged in support of the Scriptures, full-fledged advancing people towards salvation in Christ. The intelligent design movement is like taking a big, giant leap away from Darwinism, but taking no direct steps into a religious belief. Sure. There's been plenty of scientists over the years who have started out very, very Darwinian Big Bang evolutionist kind of people, who then came in fully into the camp. I don't remember a specific name. I do know, like, Hugh Ross. Dr. Hugh Ross is somebody that I don't support his theological positions, but he was one of these men who was a very hardened anti-religion person, and he made a life effort to prove that every single religious text on the planet was wrong. And so he saved the Bible for last, and he just went through, and scientifically was his point. Like, they have the wrong scientific claims. And so he went through Islam, and he went through Buddhism, and he went through a bunch of these other big religious texts or studies of information, and he went, yep, false, 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 false. He gets to the Bible, he gets to Judaism and Christianity, and it didn't take him long to say, wow, they got it all right in terms of the creation account, and everything, that every scientific claim could not be falsified that he found, and eventually he became a Christian. And he has a pretty big ministry, or a pretty big presence in terms of helping people to see that Darwinian evolution is not true. But he's a very ardent and continued proponent of a 14 billion-year-old universe, and I think that that's not where the evidence leads us. Like, when you look at soft tissue in dinosaurs, that seems to scream a young Earth, not an old Earth, right? And those kind of things. And we talked about all kinds of other things, like, again, salinity levels of the oceans, and amount of moon dust, and dozens and dozens of other factors out there that scream young Earth. Well, even fossil fuels and things like that. They've begun to realize now, first off, you can create what they call fossil fuels. They're not even sure if they're from organic or non-organic sources, but you can create coal and fossil fuels in a laboratory within days or weeks. It doesn't take millions of years to do it. Under the conditions that we can put in a laboratory or a factory, we can create fossil fuels in just a few days. And what we're finding is they almost certainly wouldn't have lasted 1 million years or 10 million years. They would not have lasted that long. Their production would have evaporated by then. And so there's all kinds of evidence of the young Earth. So I'm way beyond your question. Hugh Ross is the only name that comes to mind. I can't think of the science person that you might be referring to. Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. And I applaud that approach. If you quit your job and make all these career changes because you recognize that what I was teaching was wrong, and now I'm going to teach what is right, I think that's very admirable and should be done. I can't remember a name that goes along with that. So, okay, nope, not this. I don't have that information. Okay, so moving on a little bit. So intelligent design is often criticized because the Darwinists claim imperfection in the finished product, and a perfect God would certainly not make these errors in design. This is some of this laughable stuff. The very first, I haven't gone to many, but I've gone to a couple, well, maybe only one, I can't remember now, creation versus evolution debate, and I was really hoping to see some really good argumentation on both sides. And this one gentleman who was presenting from the Darwinianist materialistic perspective, I kept expecting, okay, well, he was the editor of Skeptic magazine. Okay, he was kind of considered to be super, worthy of a debate, capabilities. And he went. I sat there and listened to him for an hour, and I was just like, really, this is the best you've got? I mean, I was trying to be as open as I could be, and he's talking about missing links, and he's going, "Oh, we found many missing links. You creationists just keep saying they're not missing links. They're just, they were, I'm like, he didn't have any evidence. But one of the things he showed is like a whale. I can't remember, sperm whale or whatever, some whale, and he said, "See these two little bones? See those bones? We know were from legs before the whale, was once a cow." And then he went into the ocean. He said, they have no purpose other than they're just leftover, residual from his own previous ancestry. And we have, so basically saying, his whole argument is, we're ignorant of the purpose for the bones in the whale, therefore, evolution is true. Just like we're ignorant of why they talk about the coccyx, right? We have this, it's a residual of our old tailbone. You take out the coccyx, and you're going to have deep, deep, deep trouble in your regular movement of things. Okay, and then we talk about the appendix. Well, we've long since said, this appendix is a decidual organ and has absolutely no purpose whatsoever. Well, you know what? We're starting to find it has purpose. Yes, you can take it out when it's going to burst, but it actually does have a purpose within the system. And so all they keep doing is saying, we're so ignorant. That must mean that God is a bad designer, and it's absolutely not true. They used to say that about the eye, and then we come to find out, they say, I can't remember, was it Richard Dawkins or somebody else was saying, why would God make it so that when you actually look at something, it actually comes in and it goes upside down and inverted, right? And then your brain has to translate it. He goes, that's a really just terrible design. Well, we come to find out it's actually very useful and beneficial the way our eyeballs bring in information and convert it to us, and it keeps us from burning out our retinas when we do it that way. It's just incredible stuff. But it's always this appeal to ignorance. We're so ignorant, we don't understand why God would do it this way, so therefore God must be a bad designer. And then a year later, 10 years later, whatever, all of a sudden they're like, oh, wow, that's really a good design. And then they move on. Okay. So, anyway, some of the points under here. How can one determine what a perfect design would be without the knowledge of all the implications of modifying that living system? So, let's say you said, hey, the eye is a really poorly designed system. Well, you better know, if you're going to start changing people's eyeballs, you better have a pretty good idea of how you're going to improve it by making changes before you do it, right? And in this case, I don't know anybody who wants to go and become the bionic man and trade in their current eyeballs for bionic eyeballs that were created in a laboratory, because in most cases, you like the ones you were born with way better than some mechanical thing that man could invent. But all this claims to God being a poor designer is pretty laughable. Self-defeating, go ahead. Well, I mean, there are obviously we would call that like the theodicy argument or whatever. Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people and all these kind of claims, and that of course negate or completely ignores something like what we would call the reason why we're in the state in the first place. This isn't the design God created. God created a Garden of Eden. It was perfect. He called it very good 7 times, or called it good 7 times, and finished with very good. And then man caused a whole bunch of wreck and havoc in it, and now cancer and all kinds of things aren't good, but it still has the thumbprint of God's good design, even though it's been corrupted by mankind's sin in the garden.
But that's not the error they're speaking of.
No, well, I mean, they're speaking of things like the appendix or the coccyx, or and then you hear people going, if God was so smart, why did he put this drippy thing right over the top of our mouth? Shouldn't he put it on our nose somewhere else where it can't drip down as if, it's a poor design? Well, where else are you going to put the nose? Right? And why do you think that's better than where it is? That kind of stuff. But by admitting God, Darwinists would have to admit that they are not, this is the main kind of reason why Darwinists are still Darwinists, right? They would have to admit that they are not the highest authority in their discovery of truth. In a secular, materialistic world, scientists are deemed the new priesthood to whom the rest of the world is expected to pay homage and respect. We're scientists. we know more than you. We're smarter than you. You must bow down to our choices and our wills and all of this. And if we say scientifically there's no God, well, then you need to get your God out of the schools and out of the courthouse and out of the Congress and, get your God out of here. We're the new priesthood. We're in charge of everything. And they like that position. They want to be in charge of everything. They really are considered the priesthood. You hear that all the time. Well, hasn't science proven this, and hasn't science done this, and all this? And we've got the whole world ready to bow down to technology, bow down to scientific intelligence, and that's exactly what they're hoping for. And I would throw in, I'm sure that's what Satan is hoping for too. So Darwinists would lose their claim to having the highest authority in answering the basic questions of life. Remember the first chapter? Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going when we die? All those questions. They would lose their ability to make that claim. And in fact, if they then admit God, then theologians and churches would end up being the ultimate source or the ultimate purveyor of, hey, this is what the Word of God says. This is what people should do. And they would much rather retain the power and authority by getting people not to accept and believe in God and accept and believe in their Darwinianist claim so that they can still be in charge and have power, which is very, very sought after for most people in the world. This change, this acceptance of God or an intelligent design from Darwinians would fundamentally subordinate the position of the science. Money, status, power, general public would all be yielded to theologians, which they certainly don't want. That would be tough, right? And theologians, you can get 10 of them in a room, they can't agree on 10 things. So anyway, you got different problems there too. If God is accepted, though, Darwinists would have to admit they no longer have the authority or the right to determine right and wrong for their own lives, which means they can't do what they want to do. All right. If there is no God, right, and this is just the implications of the Darwinian thinking, if there is no God, then everything is lawful, especially to those in power who desire to set their own standards and attempt to force everyone else to follow them. This is the culture we live in. I want my opinion to rule over everybody else's opinion. And so I want to have the highest power. I want to have the trump card that says no one else can take away what I want to force everybody else to do. Okay? And you see this in everything. I mean, how many of you heard of I was kind of talking about with some other pastors about this today. How many of you heard of the 15-minute zones? My understanding is society today wants to get everybody to live in a 15-minute zone and take away your cars. 15-minute zones, okay? They want to get rid of cars because they're bowing down to the global warming and all that kind of climate change stuff. And they want to put hospitals and jobs and schools and whatever else in a 15-minute zone so you can walk, jog, ride a bicycle to it. And they were actually talking about, but they will give you, I think, 3 passes a year to leave your 15-minute zone. That's very generous, and it's because they're bowing down to climate change. And the scientists who claim that there is actually a thing called climate change that will destroy humanity. So it's like, and people, there's many, many millions of people who will probably sign up for this and say, yeah, I want to be that level. I want to be under that level of control. I want to put myself in prison. I want to live in a little prison compound that I never leave, and I don't want anybody else I want to control everybody else in my environment. I don't want them to own a car. I don't want them to own a fireplace. They're trying to get rid of natural gas, appliances and all this kind of stuff. They want to control everything, and this is all part of bowing down to this climate change ideology that comes from faulty science. Anyway, that's a rabbit trail. Yeah, right. Sex, power are the motivators that underlie most of our intense cultural debates, and we see that in things like abortion, homosexuality. If there is no God, if everything came about by randomness, accident, and chance, then there's no way you can say that abortion is wrong, or homosexuality is wrong, or gay marriage is wrong, or gender change options are wrong, any of this kind of stuff. Right? They're saying because they keep that God out, they can keep these things in, and that also is an incredibly wealthy, money-making kind of endeavor to create drugs and do surgeries that change people's genders and do abortions, and homosexuality is certainly not a healthy lifestyle. And so there's lots of medical needs for people in a homosexual lifestyle. So all of it revolves around power and money. And we see keeping those things out. In addition to the basic and most obvious one, if there is no God, I don't have to answer for my sins. Too often, people take positions in these debates that merely line up with their personal desires rather than taking evidence into account, right? So they start off with a presupposition. They start off with a desire that says, I'd like there not to be a God, so I'm going to invent a solution so that there is no God. They're not coming to that conclusion because clearly everything in this universe is an accident. It's all random, and there's no organization, no design, no intelligence behind anything. That's not how they're coming to that conclusion. They're coming to the conclusion saying, I don't want, so that's what I'll invent. In fact, they're making a God in their own image. They want God to approve of everything they do. One of the very first basic sins of life is to invent a God in our own image, rather than submitting to the God who we are made in the image of. But again, that gets a little bit ahead of our theological discussion here. So, a couple of points of conclusion for tonight. There are only two possibilities, right? I mean, really, it boils down to there's only two possibilities. Either God created us, or we're creating a God that we want to, in this case, God of Darwinian evolution, a God of Big Bang theories and all kinds of stuff that explain him away. But there's really only two choices. Either there's a God who created, or we're creating a God that explains everything that has been created. And that can include aliens, and that can include multiverse generators out there somewhere, and a variety of other explanations. An honest look at the facts suggests theistic creation, not macroevolution, is true. This is an objective, honest look at the facts. Says everything we see has purpose. Everything we see has design. Everything we see had a beginning, and that all demands that we have a theistic God who started it all. So it's not a battle of science versus religion, as is often the major claim. It's a battle of good science versus false science. Good science is, like we said, it's falsifiable. It's open to all lines of argumentation. Darwinian evolution is closed to God as a solution, or God as a reason for existence, and Darwinian evolution refuses to be falsified. Every single new piece of evidence, like soft tissue in dinosaur bones, is just another thing that has to be shoved into the corner and say, well, it doesn't change the facts, or doesn't change our belief about how we got here. Darwinianists would rather suppress evidence along all those lines than allow it to be represented fairly, right? And this is why there's clearly no support whatsoever for even teaching intelligent design in schools. In high schools, in colleges and universities, there is no acceptance for teaching intelligent design. Not creation, not the Bible, intelligent design. There's no tolerance for that because they only want one view advanced, Darwinian evolution. And they know that probably less than 1% of the population of the world, or certainly in America, will actually peel back the onion enough to see Darwinian evolution doesn't have a single leg to stand on. No evidence, no support, no logical reasoning, no explanation. They simply suppress the evidence, and they do not allow a different line of reasoning into their circle. So Darwinists clearly lack faith to believe that their theory would still be believed by children after these children see all the evidence between the two views. Otherwise, they would have no objection to allowing creation or intelligent design to be taught as an opposing view. If you're so confident that all of the evidence supports Darwinian evolution, why are you so active in suppressing the opposing view? If you're so convinced it will work, or that creation falls under its own weight, why not just let it be taught and let kids go, wow, I sure like Darwinianism better than I like creation. But they don't want them to make a choice. They just want to tell them what to think and convince them that their worldview is the right view. So, anyway, as you can see, through these lines of evidence, our authors in the book is saying, I don't have enough faith to believe in Darwinian evolution. It simply doesn't support the evidence. What does? Intelligence, design, creation. So that's where the book transitions to next. But we'll talk about the moral law, and that's a whole different subject. Not really science-y, just a whole different subject that is very powerful in terms of explaining that we do have a creator. So we'll look at that next week.
So that'll be out of the Mere Christianity?
Yeah, so if those of you reading along, we're going to look at the next chapter. I think it's chapter 7, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And then I'm going to look, then from there, and it may take more than 1 week, I'm going to look at the first section of Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity is like broken into 3 sections or 4 sections, I think, maybe 5. Anyway, taking the first section, which is all about the existence of the moral law, will then supplement what we see in I Don't Have Enough Faith with Mere Christianity. Excellent question. Chapter 7 in section 1, if you're reading ahead. Yeah. Be blessed. See you soon.